I never imagined I'd be starting a business at 72. The morning Dashiell told me I was too old to matter, I was carefully mending a tear in my grandmother's wedding ring quilt. 47 years of motherhood, countless sacrifices to fund his education and dreams, a lifetime of putting family first, all of it dismissed with those 5 cutting words. "You should step aside gracefully, Mom," he said, his voice cold as Vermont winter. "Let the younger generation take over." His new wife Felicity nodded approvingly from across my own dining table, as if my obsolescence was a foregone conclusion. But what my successful tech entrepreneur son didn't know was that the quilt I was mending that day would soon be worth more than his quarterly profits. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Cordelia Ashworth, and I've lived in the same Victorian house on Maple Street in Millbrook, Vermont, for 43 years. The house sits like a gentle dowager among the sugar maples, her gabled roof weathered to the color of pewter, her wraparound porch decorated with the intricate gingerbread trim that was fashionable when she was built in 1887. From my kitchen window, I can see the old textile mills that once made our town prosperous, their red brick facades now converted into artist studios and boutique shops. This morning, like every morning for the past 2 years since Harold passed, I made my coffee in the same blue ceramic mug he bought me for our 20th anniversary. The handle has a small chip from when I dropped it the day after his funeral. But I can't bring myself to throw it away. Some imperfections become precious when they carry memory. I was sitting at my hand-carved quilting frame, a wedding gift from Harold's grandmother in 1973, examining the delicate stitching on my grandmother's wedding ring quilt. The quilt had been stored in my cedar chest for decades, too precious to use, too beautiful to ignore. Recently, I'd noticed some of the cotton batting had shifted, creating small puckers in the intricate pattern of interlocking circles. Each ring was no bigger than a dinner plate, pieced together from scraps of fabric that told the story of our family's history. The deep blue calico came from a dress my great-grandmother wore to church. The sunny yellow cotton was from kitchen, curtains that had hung in my childhood home. The soft green was from a shirt my father wore to work at the lumber mill. Every piece had been saved, treasured, and transformed into something greater than its original purpose. That's what quilters do. We take the worn, the discarded, the forgotten, and weave them into beauty that lasts for generations. As I worked, my fingers moving in the rhythm I'd learned at my mother's side 60 years ago, I thought about the patterns of my own life. I'd been a textile arts major at Bennington College when I met Harold. He was studying to be a teacher, earnest and kind, with dreams of educating young minds and maybe coaching high school basketball on the side. We married the week after graduation in 1973, full of plans and possibilities. I had my own dreams then. I wanted to create art that would hang in galleries, quilts that would be featured in museums, textiles that would be studied by future generations. I had notebooks full of original patterns, sketches of designs that combined traditional techniques with contemporary aesthetics. My senior thesis project, a series of abstract quilts inspired by Vermont's changing seasons, had caught the attention of a gallery owner in Burlington who wanted to represent my work. But life had other plans. Harold got a teaching position at Millbrook Elementary, and we moved to this house. I took a job at the local fabric shop to help make ends meet while he established his career. Then Dashiell was born in 1978, followed by Rosalind in 1981 and Ezra in 1985. 3 children in 7 years, each one a blessing that required more of my time, more of my energy, more of my dreams to be set aside. When Dashiell showed an aptitude for computers in middle school, we scraped together money for a better computer, advanced programming classes, summer camps that promised to nurture his talents. When he wanted to start a business in high school, I took a second job at the craft store to help fund his entrepreneurial dreams. When he got accepted to MIT for computer science, we took out a second mortgage on the house to pay for what his partial scholarship didn't cover. I told myself it was temporary. Once the children were grown, once Harold's career was more secure, once we had more money saved, I would return to my art. I kept my sewing machine in the spare bedroom, my fabric collection carefully organized in plastic bins, my pattern books arranged on shelves like promises waiting to be kept. But temporary has a way of becoming permanent when you're not paying attention. Harold developed diabetes in his 50s, requiring more careful meal planning and medical expenses. My mother needed care in her final years, moving into our guest room for the last 6 months of her life. There was always something more pressing than my artistic ambitions, always someone whose needs seemed more urgent than my own. The children grew up seeing their mother as someone who facilitated other people's dreams, rather than pursuing her own. Dashiell, brilliant and driven, absorbed the lesson that success meant moving forward, not looking back. He graduated from MIT with highest honors, started his first tech company at 25, and by 30, had built a software development firm that employed 40 people. Rosalind became a pediatric nurse, choosing service over profit in a way. That made me proud. She married a good man named Samuel, and they live in Burlington with their 2 teenage daughters. Ezra followed his environmental conscience to law school and now works for a firm in Portland that specializes in conservation cases. Both of my younger children visit regularly, call weekly, and remember my birthday without prompting. But Dashiell became someone I barely recognized. Success had transformed my once curious son into a man who measured everything by its economic value and efficiency quotient. He spoke in buzzwords about optimizing human resources and eliminating redundancies. He married his first wife, Jennifer, when he was 32. But that marriage lasted only 3 years before he decided she was holding him back professionally. 2 years ago, he married Felicity, a 28-year-old marketing strategist who spoke fluent corporate speak and viewed everything through the lens of personal branding. She was beautiful in the polished way of someone who treats her appearance like a business investment. Gym membership, professional highlights, clothes chosen for their ability to project success rather than comfort. At Harold's funeral, Felicity had whispered to Dashiell about how the old house would need updating to be marketable, and how my hoarding tendencies would make it difficult to sell. I wasn't supposed to hear, but grief has a way of sharpening certain senses while dulling others. I pretended not to notice, focusing instead on the kindness of neighbors who brought casseroles and the warmth of Harold's former students who shared stories about his impact on their lives. In the months after Harold's death, I tried to establish a new routine. I volunteered at the library, tended my garden, continued my weekly quilting circle with 3 other women whose husbands had also passed. We called ourselves the Remnant Circle, and we met every Thursday afternoon to work on individual projects while sharing the quiet companionship of women who understood loss. But I felt myself becoming invisible, fading into the category of sweet elderly lady whose opinions carried less weight with each passing year. At family gatherings, conversations flowed around me, rather than including me. My children, well-meaning in their concern, began making decisions about my life without consulting me first. "Mom doesn't need to worry about the financial details," Dashiell would say, when discussing Harold's estate. "We'll handle all the complicated stuff." "Are you sure you should be driving in the snow, Mom?" Rosalind would ask, as if 2 years of widowhood had somehow compromised reflexes that had navigated Vermont winters for 7 decades. Even Ezra, my most thoughtful child, had started speaking to me in the patient tone usually reserved for people suffering from cognitive decline. "Take your time, Mom," he'd say when I paused to consider a question. "There's no rush." But there was a rush. Time was moving faster than I wanted to acknowledge, and I felt myself shrinking to fit the diminished expectations of people who loved me, but no longer saw me as a person capable of growth, change, or surprise. That's why, on that particular October morning, I was bent over my quilting frame with such focused intensity. Working with my hands had always been my form of meditation, a way of processing emotions too complex for words. The repetitive motion of needle through fabric, the gradual emergence of pattern from chaos, the transformation of individual pieces into a unified whole. It all served as a metaphor for the work of making sense of life. I was examining a particularly intricate section of the wedding ring pattern when I heard Dashiell's BMW pull into the driveway. The sound of expensive German engineering was unmistakable, all purring efficiency and understated power. I glanced at the kitchen clock, 9:15 a.m. on a Tuesday. Dashiell never visited during business hours unless something was wrong. Through the window, I watched him emerge from the car wearing his usual uniform of pressed khakis, button-down shirt, and sport coat. Felicity climbed out of the passenger side, checking her reflection in the side mirror before smoothing her pencil skirt and adjusting her blazer. They looked like they were arriving for a business meeting rather than visiting family. I met them at the front door, wiping my hands on the cotton apron I'd made from fabric, left over from Rosalind's childhood bedroom curtains. "This is a nice surprise," I said, though something in their demeanor suggested it might not be nice at all. "Mom, we need to talk," Dashiell said without preamble. No hug, no inquiry about my health, no acknowledgement of the pumpkins I'd arranged on the porch or the chrysanthemums blooming in the window boxes. "Of course, come in. I just made coffee." Felicity wrinkled her nose slightly as they followed me through the front hall. I saw her taking inventory. The antique coat rack that had belonged to Harold's grandfather, the faded runner on the hardwood stairs, the family photographs in mismatched frames that chronicled decades of birthdays, graduations, and holidays. In the kitchen, I poured coffee into my good china cups, the ones with the rose pattern that had been my mother's wedding gift. Dashiell sat rigidly in his chair while Felicity perched on the edge of hers, as if she might need to make a quick escape. "Mom," Dashiell began, his voice taking on the tone he probably used with underperforming employees. "Felicity and I have been talking about your situation." "My situation?" "Living alone in this big house, trying to maintain everything by yourself. It's not sustainable." I set down my coffee cup carefully. "I've been managing just fine." "But for how long?" Felicity interjected, her voice smooth as honey with the underlying note of steel. "The house needs significant updates. The heating system is inefficient. The kitchen is outdated, and don't get me started on the plumbing issues." "What plumbing issues?" Dashiell waved a dismissive hand. "The point is, you're not getting any younger, and it's time to start making practical decisions about your future." I felt something cold settle in my stomach. "What kind of decisions?" "There's a lovely assisted living community in Burlington," Felicity said, producing a glossy brochure from her designer handbag. "Sunset Manor. It's very well regarded, and it would eliminate all the stress of home maintenance." I stared at the brochure's cover photo of silver-haired people playing chess and tending small container gardens. Everyone looked generically happy, in the way of advertising models. "I'm not interested in assisted living." "Mom, be reasonable," Dashiell said. You're 72 years old. How much longer can you really expect to manage stairs, yard work, snow removal? What happens when you fall and break a hip? What happens if I don't? He looked frustrated by my refusal to accept his logic. Look, we've done the math. The house is worth about $350,000 in today's market. After we pay off the remaining mortgage and handle the necessary updates, you'd have enough to cover assisted living costs for at least 15 years. We've done the math? Felicity jumped in smoothly. Dashiell is just trying to look out for your best interests. He's worried about you living alone. And frankly, so am I. What if something happens and no one finds you for days? I thought about my neighbors, the Kowalskis, who checked on me regularly. I thought about my quilting circle friends who would notice if I missed our Thursday meetings. I thought about the mail carrier who always chatted about the weather and the grocery store clerk who asked about my garden. Apparently, Felicity had failed to notice that small-town life came with its own support systems. I appreciate your concern, I said slowly. But I'm not ready to sell the house. Dashiell's patience, never his strongest quality, began to fray. Mom, you're being stubborn. This isn't about what you want. It's about what makes sense. You can't keep living in the past. The past? The word came out sharper than I intended. All this stuff. He gestured around the kitchen, taking in the hand-painted ceramic canisters, the vintage tablecloth, the collection of antique mixing bowls displayed on open shelves. These old things, they're just clutter at this point. No one wants heavy furniture and dusty collectibles anymore. It's all about clean lines and minimal maintenance now. I looked at my kitchen, really looked at it, trying to see it through his eyes. The oak cabinets Harold had installed himself, sanding and staining each door with meticulous care. The farmhouse sink where I'd bathed 3 babies and washed countless loads of dishes from family meals. The worn linoleum that bore the scuff, marks of children's feet, and the gentle indentations from decades of daily life. To Dashiell, it was outdated. To me, it was home. Mom, Felicity said in the tone one might use with a confused child. You have to understand that holding on to the past isn't healthy. You need to embrace this new phase of your life. What new phase is that? The phase where you step aside gracefully and let the younger generation take over, Dashiell said. You've done your part. You raised us. You took care of Dad. You've lived a full life. Now it's time to let someone else handle the difficult decisions. The words hung in the air like a challenge. Step aside gracefully. Let the younger generation take over. You've done your part. I thought about all the parts I'd played over the years. Devoted wife, sacrificing mother, helpful daughter, reliable volunteer. In each role, I'd been valued for what I could give, not for who I was. And now, apparently, my usefulness had expired. I see, I said quietly. Dashiell seemed encouraged by what he interpreted as acquiescence. I know it's a big change, but you'll be so much happier without all these responsibilities. No more worrying about house repairs or yard maintenance or whether you remember to lock all the doors. And you'll have built-in social activities, Felicity added brightly. Game nights, craft sessions, group exercise classes. It'll be like summer camp for seniors. I almost laughed at the absurdity of it. After 7 decades of life, I was being offered summer camp for seniors as my reward for stepping aside gracefully. When would this transition happen? I asked. Well, the sooner the better, Dashiell said. The housing market is still strong, and Sunset Manor has a waiting list. If we move quickly, we could have you settled in by the new year. 3 months, They wanted to dismantle my entire life in 3 months. I stood up slowly, my arthritic knees protesting the movement. I need to think about this. Mom, there's nothing to think about, Dashiell said with the impatience of someone accustomed to quick decisions and immediate implementation. It's the logical choice. For whom? The question seemed to surprise him. For everyone involved. You'll be safer and more comfortable, and we won't have to worry about you struggling to manage things you're too old to handle. Too old to handle. There it was. The verdict that rendered. Everything I'd accomplished. Everything I knew. Everything I still hoped to do completely irrelevant. I walked them to the door, accepting Felicity's air kiss and Dashiell's perfunctory hug. As their BMW disappeared down Maple Street, I returned to my quilting frame and picked up my needle. My hands were shaking slightly, but whether from anger, hurt, or determination, I couldn't say. I looked down at the wedding ring quilt, at the intricate pattern my grandmother had created with her own hands more than a century ago. She'd been 19 when she made it, preparing for her marriage to a man she'd known for 6 months. She'd chosen each piece of fabric with care, stitched each ring with hope, created something beautiful that would outlast her own lifetime. The quilt had survived the Great Depression, 2 world wars, the deaths of the people who'd loved it most. It had been passed down from mother to daughter, a tangible connection to the women who'd come before me. And now, Dashiell wanted me to treat it like clutter, something outdated that needed to be discarded to make room for clean lines and minimal maintenance. I thought about all the women in my family who'd been told their time was up, who'd been encouraged to step aside gracefully when they still had so much to give. My great-grandmother, who'd continued to take in sewing at 80. My grandmother, who'd managed the family farm until she was 93. My mother, who'd volunteered at the hospital until 6 months before her death at 87. None of them had stepped aside gracefully when they still had work to do. Picked up my phone and dialed a number I hadn't called in months. Beatrice Whitmore speaking. B, it's Cordelia Ashworth. I was wondering if you might have time to look at something for me. The devastating words from my son echoed in my mind for 3 sleepless nights after that awful morning. You're too old to matter. Step aside gracefully. Let the younger generation take over. Each phrase felt like a small death. The systematic dismantling of everything I thought I'd built over 7 decades of living. But on the 4th morning, something shifted. I woke before dawn, not from anxiety this time, but from a dream so vivid it felt like prophecy. I dreamed of my grandmother's hands guiding mine as we worked together on the wedding ring quilt. Her voice strong and clear despite the 40 years since her death. Child, she'd said in the dream, a quilt is only as strong as its weakest stitch. But when every stitch holds true, the whole becomes greater than its parts. I rose in the pre-dawn darkness and made my way to the quilting frame. In the gray light filtering through the kitchen windows, I examined my grandmother's work with new eyes. What I'd always seen as a family heirloom, I now began to recognize as something far more significant. This wasn't just a quilt. It was a masterpiece. The stitching was impossibly precise, 15 stitches per inch when most quilters struggled to achieve 12. The pattern was mathematically complex, requiring advanced planning to ensure the interlocking rings aligned perfectly across the entire surface. The fabric choices revealed an artist's eye for color and texture, creating subtle gradations of tone that made the rings seem to glow from within. I'd grown up sleeping under this quilt, treating it as comfort rather than art. It had been packed away when I married Harold. Too precious for daily use, but not precious enough to display. For 40 years it had languished in my cedar chest, waiting for someone to recognize its true value. That someone, I realized, would have to be me. I spent the morning researching antique quilts online, something I'd never thought to do before. What I discovered made my coffee grow cold as I stared at the computer screen Harold had bought for keeping household accounts. Wedding ring quilts from the 1920s, especially those with documented provenance and exceptional craftsmanship, were selling at auction for thousands of dollars, museum-quality pieces, and I was beginning to suspect my grandmother's quilt qualified, commanded prices that made my mortgage payment look insignificant. But more than the monetary value, I was struck by the reverence with which these textiles were discussed in collector forums and academic articles. They were described as vernacular art, material culture, and repositories of women's history. They were studied by scholars, displayed in galleries, and treasured by collectors who understood their significance. My grandmother hadn't just made a quilt. She'd created a work of art that happened to keep people warm. I called Beatrice Whitmore that afternoon. Bea had owned the most prestigious textile gallery in New England before retiring 5 years ago. We'd known each other peripherally through the local arts council, but I'd always felt intimidated by her expertise and reputation. Now, desperate for professional validation of what I suspected about the quilt, I swallowed my nervousness and dialed her number. "Cordelia!" Bea's voice was warm, despite my long absence from the arts community. "What a lovely surprise. How are you managing since Harold's passing?" "I'm finding my way," I said carefully. "Bea, I have a favor to ask. I have a quilt that belonged to my grandmother, and I'm wondering if you might take a look at it. I'm beginning to think it might be more significant than I realized." "Of course, dear. I'd be delighted. Shall I come to you? Or would you prefer to bring it to my studio?" The offer to come to me was typical of Bea's generosity, but I found myself wanting to venture into the wider world. "Would tomorrow afternoon work for me to visit you?" "Perfect. Shall we say 2 o'clock? Bea's studio occupied the converted carriage house behind her Victorian home on the historic end of Main Street. The space was flooded with north-facing light, and every surface displayed examples of textile artistry from around the world. Amish quilts, African kente cloth, Indian saris, Native American blankets. Walking into her studio was like entering a museum dedicated to the global language of fiber and thread. I'd wrapped the wedding ring quilt in acid-free tissue paper and transported it in the largest flat box I could find. Bea helped me carefully, unfold it on her examination table, and I watched her expression change as more of the pattern was revealed. "Oh, my dear," she whispered, bending closer to examine the stitching. "Oh, my." For the next hour, Bea subjected the quilt to the kind of scrutiny usually reserved for masterpieces. She examined it with a magnifying glass, measured the consistency of the stitching, photographed details of the pattern and fabric combinations. She consulted reference books, made notes, and asked detailed questions about its provenance. "Your grandmother made this herself?" she asked for the 3rd time. "Yes, in 1923 for her wedding the following year." "And it's been in your family ever since?" "Never sold, never displayed publicly. It lived on my grandparents' bed until my grandmother died, then my mother stored it in her hope chest. I've had it since she passed in 1995. Bea sat back in her chair, looking at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Cordelia, do you have any idea what you have here?" "I'm beginning to suspect it's valuable." "Valuable doesn't begin to cover it. This is museum-quality work. The technical skill is extraordinary. But beyond that, it's a stunning example of early 20th century vernacular art. The color choices, the precision of the piecing, the innovation in the pattern layout. This is the work of a master craft person." My throat felt tight. What do you think it's worth? Monetarily? At auction, with proper documentation and provenance, I'd estimate anywhere from $15,000 to $20,000. But honestly, its historical and artistic value exceeds its market price. This belongs in a museum collection. $20,000. The number hit me like a physical blow. My grandmother's wedding quilt, the old thing that Dashiell had dismissed as clutter, was worth more than half of what he expected to net from selling the entire house. There's something else, B continued. Have you considered that if your grandmother created work of this caliber, there might be other pieces in your collection? I thought about the cedar chest upstairs, packed with textiles I'd inherited but never properly examined. My grandmother's hope chest contents, my mother's unfinished projects, my own abandoned experiments from college. Suddenly, what I'd viewed as sentimental clutter took on new possibilities. B, I said slowly, what would you think about me getting back into textile work? Professionally, I mean. Her face lit up. I think it's a wonderful idea. You have the eye, you have the skills, and frankly, there's a growing market for restoration work and custom pieces. The sustainable fashion movement has people rediscovering the value of quality craftsmanship. But I'm 72 years old. So? Louise Bourgeois didn't have her first retrospective until she was 71. Grandma Moses didn't start painting until she was 78. Age brings perspective and freedom from the need to please anyone but yourself. I felt something loosening in my chest, like a knot being carefully untied. I wouldn't know where to start. Start with what you know. You understand textiles, you understand quality, and you clearly have access to remarkable pieces. There are people who would pay handsomely for expert restoration, authentication, and conservation services. That evening I climbed the stairs to the spare bedroom that had served as my sewing room for 40 years. The vintage Singer sewing machine sat where I'd left it 6 months ago, after finishing a set of curtains for Rosalind's daughter's bedrooms. Boxes of fabric were stacked neatly on shelves, organized by color and type. A rainbow of cotton, wool, silk, and linen, accumulated over decades of careful shopping and gift receiving. I opened the cedar chest that held my textile inheritance. Beneath layers of tissue paper and lavender sachets, I found treasures I'd forgotten I owned. A delicate christening gown hand-sewn by my great-grandmother. A collection of embroidered pillowcases my mother had made during her engagement. A set of lace doilies that had adorned my grandmother's parlor table. And at the bottom of the chest, wrapped in faded muslin, I found something that made my breath catch. Another quilt, this one unfinished, with a note pinned to the top in my grandmother's careful handwriting. For Cordelia, when she's ready to understand. The pattern was even more complex than the wedding ring quilt, a design I'd never seen before, combining traditional blocks with innovative settings. The fabric choices were bold for the 1920s, featuring deep jewel tones and unexpected combinations that created a sense of movement across the surface. My grandmother had died when I was 12, long before I'd shown any interest in quilting. She'd never seen me learn to sew, never witnessed my college textile work, never known I'd inherited her artistic sensibilities. Yet somehow, she'd foreseen that someday I would need this gift, this challenge, this vote of confidence from beyond the grave. I spread the unfinished quilt across my bed, studying the intricate piecing and imagining my grandmother's hands working each block. The pattern was so complex it would have required advanced mathematical planning. The color relationships were sophisticated enough to hang in a contemporary art gallery. This wasn't just a family heirloom. This was my inheritance in the truest sense, not just fabric and thread, but a legacy of artistic vision and technical mastery. I picked up my phone and called Rosalind. "Mom, is everything okay? It's almost 10 o'clock. "I'm fine, sweetheart. Better than fine, actually. I wanted to ask you something. Do you remember your great-grandmother's quilts?" "Of course. I used to love the one with all the circles. You used to tell me stories about each ring representing a different family member. What would you think if I told you that quilt is worth $20,000? Silence on the other end of the line. Then, "Mom, are you feeling all right?" I laughed, really laughed, for the first time since Harold's death. "I'm feeling more all right than I have in years. Rosalind, I think I'm going to start a business." "What kind of business?" "Textile restoration and authentication. Your great-grandmother left me more than just quilts. She left me a masterclass in artistry that I'm finally ready to appreciate." "That sounds wonderful, Mom. But what brought this on?" I thought about how to explain the shift that had occurred since Dashiell's visit, the way his dismissal had paradoxically awakened something I'd thought was permanently dormant. Let's just say I've decided not to step aside gracefully quite yet. The next morning I began the work of transforming myself from dismissed widow to professional textile artist. I started by photographing every piece in my collection, documenting the provenance and condition of each item. I researched restoration techniques, conservation methods, and appraisal processes. I joined online forums for textile collectors and dealers, absorbing terminology and market trends. Most importantly, I began to see my inherited knowledge as valuable intellectual property rather than outdated hobby skills. I knew how to identify handmade versus machine stitching. I could date textiles by their fabric, dyes, and construction techniques. I understood the historical context that gave pieces their significance. These weren't random bits of information I'd picked up over the years. This was expertise, the kind that people pay consultants to provide. I decided to start small, offering my services to local antique dealers and collectors. My first client was Margaret Ellis, who owned an antique shop on the other side of town. She'd inherited a collection of vintage linens and wanted to know which pieces were worth selling versus keeping for personal use. Walking into Ellis Antiques with my authentication kit felt like stepping into a new identity. I wasn't just Cordelia the widow, Cordelia the mother, Cordelia the woman who was too old to matter. I was Cordelia Ashworth, textile expert, bringing professional knowledge to solve a client's problem. Margaret spread her inherited linens across a table in the back room of her shop. Within minutes, I'd identified several pieces of significant value. A set of Madeira-embroidered placemats from the 1920s, a hand-woven linen tablecloth with drawn threadwork, and a collection of tatted lace collars that were museum-quality examples of Victorian needlework. "How much should I ask for these?" Margaret asked, clearly impressed by my detailed explanations of each piece's significance. The placemats could easily bring $200 for the set. The tablecloth, if it's authenticated and marketed correctly, could be worth up to $500. The lace collars should be sold individually to collectors, probably $50 to $75 each. Margaret looked at me with new respect. "Cordelia, would you be interested in doing this professionally? I have clients who bring me textiles all the time, and I never know how to price them fairly. What did you have in mind?" "Consultation services, authentication, valuation, maybe some restoration work for pieces that need repair. I'd be happy to refer clients to you and take a small finder's fee for successful consultations." I felt a flutter of excitement in my chest. "I think I'd like that very much." That afternoon, I walked into the Millbrook Public Library and asked to use their computer to set up a business email account. Cordelia.ashworth.textilesagmail.com felt like claiming a new identity, one that honored both my family history and my individual expertise. I designed a simple business card on the library's computer. Cordelia Ashworth, Textile Authentication and Restoration Services. I listed my new email address and phone number, and added a tagline that felt both professional and personal, preserving the threads that connect us to history. When I picked up the printed cards from the local print shop, holding them felt like holding possibility itself. I was no longer just someone's mother, someone's widow, someone who needed to step aside gracefully. I was a woman in business, offering services that had value in the marketplace. That evening, I called Bea to tell her about my first client and my plans to formalize my consultation services. "I'm so proud of you," she said warmly. "You know, I've been thinking about your grandmother's unfinished quilt. Have you considered completing it?" "I'm not sure I'm skilled enough to match her work. Cordelia, you've been underestimating yourself for decades. Your grandmother chose you to inherit that quilt. She must have seen something in you that suggested you'd be capable of finishing what she started." After we hung up, I went upstairs to study the unfinished quilt again. My grandmother had completed about 2/3 of the design, leaving careful notes about the intended pattern progression. The remaining blocks were cut and partially pieced, waiting for someone with the skill and patience to complete her vision. I realized that finishing this quilt would be more than just a craft project. It would be a conversation across generations, a collaboration between the woman I was and the woman I was becoming. It would be proof that some things improve with age rather than diminishing. I threaded my needle and took the first stitch in, what would become my masterpiece. Not because I created it alone, but because I had the courage to honor the artistic legacy I'd inherited and add my own voice to its continuing story. And for a while, that was enough, more than enough. The days began to take on a new rhythm. Early mornings spent cataloging and photographing heirloom textiles, afternoons fielding inquiries from Margaret Ellis's referrals, and evenings at the sewing frame, slowly but steadily, completing the unfinished quilt my grandmother left behind. The steady click of the needle through cloth became the heartbeat of my new life. And for the first time in decades, I felt my sense of purpose come not from what I could do for others, but from what I could build for myself. Rosalind visited more frequently, bringing her daughters who delighted in my growing collection of fabrics and threads. They asked questions, real questions, not the politely performative kind. One afternoon, little Amelia picked up a swatch of indigo-dyed cotton and whispered, "It looks like the sky just before it rains." And in that moment I saw the inheritance being passed along, not just of cloth or skill, but of language, intuition, artistry. Even Ezra called more often. We had long talks about legacy, justice, and the parallel ways we'd each tried to preserve something sacred. He in his work with the land, I with thread and memory. He asked if he could commission a piece to hang in his office, a wall quilt inspired by old-growth forests. I nearly cried. Even Jasper, dear, steady Jasper, grew more attentive. He brought over books on textile preservation, treated me to dinner at a little bistro tucked into an old mill near the river, and once, after a particularly late evening talking about our lost spouses, he rested his hand over mine and simply said, "I think you've only just begun." It should have been the calm before a final rise, the gathering of strength before the great unveiling. But the twist was already brewing, unnoticed, in the quiet corners of my new life. It began, as many modern upheavals do, with an email. The subject line was innocuous. Inquiry regarding authenticated quilt. The sender's name meant nothing to me. Florence Bancroft, Principal, Bancroft Textiles Limited. But as I read the message, my pulse quickened. Dear Ms. Ashworth, I recently became aware of your appraisal of a wedding ring quilt dated 1923, attributed to a Ms. Eleanor May Whitlock of Millbrook, Vermont. Your name was listed in the appraisal documentation provided to a mutual contact. I believe we may need to discuss this attribution further, as it conflicts with an ongoing verification project tied to my firm. Please advise on a suitable time to speak. Regards, Florence Bancroft, Bancroft Textiles Limited, www.bancrofttextiles.com. I stared at the message for several minutes, dread and confusion battling for dominance. I'd heard of Bancroft Textiles. Florence was a recognized name in the textile collector community, a gatekeeper of sorts. Her reputation was solid, though, not without controversy. She'd built a business on acquiring underappreciated antique textiles at estate sales, then reselling them to high-end collectors at considerable markup. Some called her an expert, others a vulture. I forwarded the email to B with a note that read simply, "Help. What is this about?" Within the hour, my phone rang. "Cordelia," B said. No preamble. "You're about to step into a hornet's nest." I gathered that. What is she talking about? What conflict? Florence has been trying to authenticate a group of quilts she claims came from an anonymous New England artist, whose style she's branded as the Silent Seamstress. She's already sold 2 to a private collector in London. Unverified. Mind you, based purely on her story of a reclusive Vermont woman from the 1920s who produced work far ahead of her time. She's staked her reputation on it. If your grandmother's quilt is truly what you believe it to be, Florence's entire narrative may unravel. My heart began to race. You think she's using a false attribution? I think she's trying to build a legend she can profit from. And she didn't count on you surfacing with hard evidence. Your grandmother's label, your family photos, the stitching samples. It's more than enough to challenge her version of events. I felt suddenly nauseated. So what happens now? B sighed. She'll likely try to discredit you, or claim your quilt is a forgery. She may offer to buy it outright to silence the conflict. Whatever she does, she won't let go easily. Too much money's on the line. B's voice softened. You need to decide if you're ready to fight this, because it won't stay small. The idea of confrontation made my stomach twist, but something deeper stirred beneath the anxiety. Anger. How many times had women's work been stolen, repackaged and sold by people who never knew their hands? How often had our creations been treated as anonymous, quaint, less than art? This was my grandmother's legacy. This was my legacy, and I wasn't going to let anyone rewrite it. I emailed Florence back that evening. Dear Ms. Bancroft, I am available to speak this Friday at 10 a.m. Please confirm your availability. I will be joined by my consultant, Ms. Beatrice Whitmore. Kindly bring any documentation you believe conflicts with the verified provenance of Ms. Eleanor May Whitlock's 1923 wedding ring quilt. Sincerely, Cordelia Ashworth. When Friday came, I wore my best linen blouse, pulled my silver-streaked hair into a loose twist, and met B at the conference room of the Millbrook Public Library, where we'd reserved a private space. Florence arrived precisely on time, immaculate in a sleek navy pantsuit, her platinum hair coiled like a question mark behind her head. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story. The introductions were formal, brittle. Florence barely concealed her condescension, offering a thin-lipped smile as she set down a slim leather folio on the table. "I'll be frank," she said, eyes flitting over my face as though calculating my weakness. "Your attribution complicates things. The style of your quilt, the timeline. It matches several pieces I've already moved, and unless we find a way to reconcile that, you may find your piece deemed derivative or misattributed." "On the contrary," Bea said smoothly. "Ms. Ashworth's documentation is extensive. Family records, photographs, direct lineage. I believe the burden of proof lies with you, Ms. Bancroft." Florence's jaw tightened. Some might consider it convenient that the quilt only surfaced now. I leaned forward, voice calm but steady. Some might consider it inconvenient that the truth has finally surfaced. Florence's lips parted slightly in surprise, as though she hadn't expected me to speak in full sentences, much less with conviction. Bea slid a folder across the table. "Here is a notarized statement from Cordelia's mother, written in 1992, describing the quilt and its maker. Included are dated photographs from the 1940s and 1950s showing the quilt in use. The original sewing patterns used in the quilt are also available for examination, and they match the unique layout and construction style. None of the pieces you've attributed to the so-called silent seamstress have comparable documentation." Florence flipped through the contents, eyes narrowing. "I'll have to consult with my legal advisor," she said coolly. "But if this documentation holds up, we'll need to revisit certain claims made in previous catalogs. It may require reclassification." Her tone made the word sound like an inconvenience, not a correction of history. "If you're willing to make a formal retraction," Bea said, "we may consider a collaborative effort to honor Ms. Whitlock's legacy properly. But any attempt to suppress this information will be met with public recourse." That was Bea's way of saying, "Try me, and I'll burn you to the ground." Florence rose to leave. "You'll hear from me by next week." When she was gone, Bea turned to me, eyes glittering. "Well, that went better than I expected. I was still processing what had just occurred. Do you really think she'll back down?" "I think she'll calculate her odds, and right now, you hold the better hand." But it wasn't just about Florence anymore. In the weeks that followed, the story began to spread, first through local collectors, then on textile preservation forums, and finally in an online article titled "Grandmother's Quilt Reveals Forgotten. Legacy of 1920s female artist." I'd given the interview reluctantly, but the journalist, a woman in her 30s who'd grown up watching her own grandmother sew, had asked thoughtful questions. She wasn't after drama. She wanted to understand the quiet artistry that had gone unnoticed for generations. She framed the piece not as a scandal, but as a reclamation, and in doing so, she triggered something I never expected. Within a week of the article going live, I received dozens of emails, not just from collectors, but from women around the country. Some young, some elderly, all with stories of artistic inheritance ignored or devalued. One woman in Arizona wrote to say that her great-aunt had designed embroidery patterns for Sears Roebuck in the 1930s, but her family had always treated it like a footnote. "Reading your story made me realize it was a chapter," she wrote. Another message stopped me cold. "Hello, Ms. Ashworth. I believe we may be distant cousins. My name is Margot Whitlock, and my grandmother was Eleanor's younger sister, Lucinda. I was stunned to see the quilt in your article. It matches stories passed down through our branch of the family. We'd always been told that Eleanor was something of a prodigy with the needle, But after she married and moved to Millbrook, we lost touch. I have a box of letters and sketches signed EMW that I found in our attic years ago. Would you be interested in seeing them? My hand trembled as I typed back. The box of letters arrived 2 days later, shipped overnight in a surprisingly sturdy cardboard parcel with fragile stickers covering every inch. Inside, wrapped in brown craft paper and cushioned with tissue, was a cedar-scented wooden box about the size of a bread loaf. An envelope sat on top with a neat looping script. For Cordelia Ashworth. From Margot Whitlock. With gratitude and shared memory. My hands shook as I opened the box. Inside were bundles of letters tied with silk ribbon. Faded, blue and rose, alongside several sheets of yellowing paper featuring quilt patterns drawn in pencil. One sketch was nearly identical to the design of the unfinished quilt I was now restoring. But this one was signed clearly. E.M. Whitlock, 1925. The letters, dated from 1919 to 1941, were full of references to fabric orders, patterns, developed from nature walks, discussions about colors inspired by the northern Vermont foliage, and even references to Eleanor's early dreams of submitting work to a women's exhibition in Boston. One note caught my breath. Lucinda, they say the art world will never take quilts seriously, but I believe someday, maybe not in my lifetime, someone will look at our stitches and see a story, not just a bed covering. And if that someone is you, or someone we love, then it was all worth it. I clutched the letter like it was a rope pulling me across time. This was more than legacy. This was a charge. A mission passed down like breath from one woman to another. I called Bea immediately, and she drove over before dusk. We examined every letter together, cataloging the contents, making digital scans, documenting provenance. We both knew what this meant. Cordelia, Bea said, her voice thick with emotion. This isn't just a quilt. This is an archive, a full-bodied, artistically significant archive of one of the most under-recognized female textile artists of her generation. I exhaled slowly. I think I need to tell her story, not just through quilts, but fully. Bea's eyes lit up. You mean an exhibition? I mean a retrospective. Eleanor Whitlock, the hidden threads. We have the quilts. We have the letters, the unfinished work, the family, the evidence. She deserves to be seen. And just like that, my business, which had started as a quiet restoration practice, pivoted, transformed. Florence Bancroft, to her credit, did send a public retraction, though her wording was careful, referring to newly surfaced evidence and additional verified sources. She removed all reference to the silent seamstress and agreed to forward our documentation to the London collector, who had already purchased one of Eleanor's unverified quilts. That collector, after reviewing our files, agreed to loan it to any upcoming exhibition we organized. It was the beginning of something much larger than me. But the plot twist wasn't done with me yet. 2 weeks after receiving the letters, while reviewing fabric swatches for the final border of the restored quilt, I heard the mailbox clang shut. I opened the door expecting a bill or maybe another inquiry. My services had become a modest success online, but what I found made my chest tighten. A large manila envelope, postmarked from Boston. The return address read, Silverwood and Crane, LLP, Estate Division. I slid a knife under the flap and pulled out a stack of legal documents, neatly clipped. On top was a letter. Dear Ms. Ashworth, we are the legal representatives for the estate of Mr. Victor Crane, formerly of Boston, Massachusetts. During a recent inventory of archival materials bequeathed to the Boston Women's Arts Collective, We identified several items relevant to your family history. Included are excerpts from a 1926 ledger of the Millbrook Women's Creative Society, as well as a notarized will dated 1931 that may pertain to your grandmother, Eleanor May Whitlock. While the original documents remain in the archives of the collective, we are enclosing certified copies for your review. Respectfully, Jennifer Rowland Archivist, Silverwood and Crane LLP. Beneath the letter were 2 documents, a ledger page and a partial will. The ledger was remarkable in its own right. It listed Eleanor as one of the founding members of the Millbrook Women's Creative Society, a name I'd only ever seen once before, in one of the letters from Margot's box. There was even an inventory line. Loaned, quilt pattern, number 7, Echoes of the River, artist, E.M. Whitlock. But the will changed everything. It was addressed to my daughters and to their daughters. A portion read, "It is my wish that the artistic work done under the name of the Millbrook Women's Creative Society not be separated from the names of the women who built it, especially Eleanor May Whitlock, Catherine H. Goodwin, Esther Fan, and Louisa Devereux. Their names must never be lost to time. Their work is their legacy, and their legacy belongs to the generations of women who follow after them. This I ask in good faith and legal confidence. Victor M. Crane." Patron B read it in stunned silence. Victor Crane was one of the major textile art collectors in the Northeast. If he was involved in preserving Eleanor's work, that changes everything. It gives weight to what she created, not just as personal art, but as part of a recognized collective. We need to find the others, I said. If Eleanor worked with 3 other women, if they were building something together, we owe it to all of them to tell the whole story. B placed a steady hand over mine. You do realize what you're about to take on, don't you? I nodded slowly, the air thick with meaning. Yes, this is bigger than a business. It's a reclamation, a resistance, a resurrection. And then, like clockwork, the phone rang. Unknown number. Cordelia Ashworth? A voice asked. Male, polished. Yes, my name is Charles Ludlow. I'm an acquisitions director for the Vermont Museum of Craft and Heritage. We recently came across an article on your restoration of the 1930 wedding ring quilt by Eleanor Whitlock. Would you be open to discussing a possible exhibition partnership? I laughed, out of sheer disbelief. Mr. Ludlow, I said, trying to steady my voice. I believe we have much to talk about. Over the next month, my world reshaped itself daily. With Bee's help and the encouragement of Rosalind and Ezra, who both jumped in with skills, Rosalind helping with cataloging, and Ezra offering legal advice pro bono, we began formal plans for a traveling exhibit. I named it, Stitched in Silence, the Lost Collective of Millbrook. Florence, clearly aware she had lost the upper hand, tried to regain relevance by offering to fund a portion of the exhibit in exchange for being named. As a supporting sponsor, Bee nearly spit out her tea at the audacity. I considered it carefully, then agreed. But under one condition. All marketing would name Cordelia Ashworth and Beatrice Whitmore as curators, and all narrative framing would focus on the women who created the quilts, not the collectors who tried to claim them. The media took interest, not just art publications, but the Boston Globe, the New England Artisan, and eventually the New York Times art section. Headlines ran with phrases like, 72-year-old artist, unearths forgotten, quilt collective, a legacy in thread, how one woman resurrected hidden histories, the Millbrook Four, stitching feminist art into America's quilt story, and Dashiell. He didn't call, not at first. But Felicity did. She left a voicemail on a Thursday morning that I listened to twice before deleting. "Hi, Cordelia. It's Felicity. So, we've been seeing the press about the exhibit, and well, it's amazing. Just wanted to say congratulations. Also, Dashiell's wondering if you'd consider coming to dinner sometime. No pressure, of course. He's proud of you." Proud of me? The phrase landed like glass on tile. Shiny, fragile, and perhaps too late. I didn't respond. Instead, I turned to Teddy. My grandson had begun stopping by more frequently, walking over from his friend's house or biking the long way home just to pop in. We'd started working together on a small art quilt he wanted to make for his school's art fair, one inspired by our family women. He said, "Dad said you're famous now," he told me one afternoon, eyes wide, as he helped me pin the borders of his project. "Like, your quilt is going to be in a museum." "Not just mine," I corrected gently. "Your great-great-grandmother's too." "Cool. She sounds like she was awesome." "She was. And so are you." Teddy grinned. "I think it's funny how grown-ups always figure stuff out after it's too late. You didn't change. They just finally noticed." Out of the mouths of 12-year-olds. One evening, as I sat at the sewing frame finishing the last few stitches on Eleanor's quilt, now complete, now alive again, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. The twist wasn't that I had rediscovered a calling. It was that the world eventually had to catch up to the value of what was always there. I was never too old to matter. The people who dismissed me simply lacked the vision to see me clearly. Now they would have no choice. The morning light filtered through the lace curtains in my kitchen, casting stitched shadows across the counter, like quiet testaments to the work still unfolding. I cradled my coffee in the chipped blue mug, the same one Harold had given me for our 20th anniversary. It no longer symbolized grief. It had become a touchstone, a reminder of how love, even in its absence, can be a foundation. The exhibition was 6 weeks away. Stitched in silence, the Lost Collective of Millbrook had grown from an idea into a full production, complete with a confirmed venue, 3 borrowed collector quilts, including one from the London buyer, a modest grant from the Vermont Council on Women's Arts, and enough media attention to ensure that when the doors opened, people would come. The museum had even agreed to dedicate one gallery to the Ashworth inheritance, a term be coined for the body of work that linked my family's textiles across 4 generations. I should have been elated, and in many ways I was. But the more real the exhibition became, the more I sensed the pressure building. The pressure of doing justice not only to Eleanor and the other women of the Millbrook Collective, but to myself, to the girl I used to be, to the dreams I had buried under school lunches and soccer cleats and mortgage payments. Each morning I woke with a mental list of things to do: finalize exhibit labels, coordinate quilt mounts, review press releases, complete a gallery talk outline. But increasingly my mind turned towards something unlisted, something quieter, harder to define: reckoning. It had taken decades to find the courage to return to my work, and now that the world was finally listening, I felt the weight of being seen, not for what I'd done for others, but for who I truly was. That level of visibility was thrilling, but it was also terrifying. One particularly restless night, I found myself pacing the upstairs hallway. Unable to sleep, I passed the old photo wall, the one with fading prints of birthday parties and school dances, and paused in front of a candid shot from 1987. I was standing in the garden, holding Ezra on my hip, laughing at something Harold had clearly just said. I looked so young, so full of light. Yet even then I remembered feeling tired. Tired in that deep, invisible way women carry when they're always putting someone else first. It struck me then. I was preparing for more than just a show. Was preparing for a confrontation. With my past, with my family, with the son who had once told me I was too old to matter. And that confrontation was coming sooner than I expected. Cordelia, are you sitting down? Bea never asked that unless something significant had happened. Yes, I said, setting down my coffee as I pulled the phone closer to my ear. Tell me. I just got off the phone with Charles Ludlow from the museum. Brace yourself. Dashiell called him. My stomach dropped. Called him? What for? Apparently, he wanted to know if there was any legal or intellectual property claim he could make against your segment of the exhibit. Claimed the quilts belonged to the family, and that you were using them to promote a personal agenda. I laughed, bitter and low. He's unbelievable. I thought you should know, Bea said gently. He's not just passively watching from the sidelines anymore. He's getting agitated. I didn't reply at first. I was too busy calculating how much of this was ego, how much was wounded pride, and how much was Felicity's whisper in his ear. Bea sighed. Cordelia, this is your story. Don't let him steal the narrative. I won't, I said, my voice firmer than I expected. He had his chance to believe in me. Now he can buy a ticket like everyone else. By the following week, the exhibit's promotional materials were everywhere. Flyers in coffee shops, ads in regional newspapers, and a short segment on Vermont Public Radio that featured snippets of my interview alongside recordings of the gallery prep work. One afternoon, as I walked through the nearly finished museum installation with Jasper and Rosalind, I caught sight of my grandmother's quilt, now fully restored, floating behind museum-grade glass. The lighting had been designed to mimic soft morning sun, bringing out the subtle texture and intricate patterning that made her work sing. Jasper, always the quiet observer, placed a hand over his heart. She'd be proud, Cordelia, and not just of what you saved, but what you built. Rosalind nodded, her voice hushed with reverence. It's strange. I spent so many years thinking of these quilts as just Grandma's old things. But now, they feel monumental. They always were, I said softly. We just weren't taught to see them that way. Rosalind hesitated, then took my hand. You know Dashiell's probably going to show up for opening night, right? I know. Do you want me to talk to him first? No, I said, surprising even myself. Let him see it. Let him see all of it. The final weeks before the opening were a swirl of logistics, emotion, and unexpected challenges. Florence Bancroft, true to form, sent over her sponsorship benefits list, which included a bullet point about speaking at the press preview. I vetoed it without discussion. This wasn't her story to narrate. She could stand in the audience like anyone else. Margaret Ellis, my first client and now a dear friend, offered to lend her great-grandmother's lacework to the exhibit, which gave me the idea to include a community tribute wall, an invitation for other women in town to submit heirloom textiles or photographs with stories attached. We'd hang them on clotheslines across one of the back walls. The day after we made the announcement, the museum inbox was flooded with submissions. One woman sent a photo of a table runner stitched by her mother in post-war Japan before immigrating to the U.S. Another contributed a piece of embroidery made during the 1960s in a Cuban resettlement camp. A third dropped off an entire handmade christening gown that had passed through 5 generations of Appalachian women. I read each story with tears in my eyes. These weren't just textiles. They were lifelines, testimonies, proof of lives lived with grace and tenacity and quiet brilliance. I stitched their stories into the exhibition fabric like hidden lining, woven into every description, every placard, every curated space, and still, beneath the pride and purpose, the tremor of anticipation grew. I was walking towards something irreversible. 1 week before opening, the unexpected happened. Teddy came to visit, his cheeks flushed from biking, his backpack bulging with something large and oddly shaped. "Can I show you something?" he asked. "Always." He unzipped the backpack and pulled out a quilt. Or rather, a quilt top. It wasn't finished, but it was stitched together beautifully. Blocks of comic book panels, scraps of flannel, even a swatch from an old t-shirt I recognized from a trip we'd taken to the Adirondacks when he was 6. "You made this?" I asked, stunned. "Yeah, for school. It's for the project on family traditions." I asked Dad for help, but he didn't really know anything. So I just remembered stuff. I watched your videos, and I asked Mom to teach me how to use the machine. I swallowed hard. "Teddy, this is incredible." He shrugged. "I wanted to make something that felt like us." I looked down at the imperfect, joyful chaos of it. His small stitches. The hand-printed label that read, "The Ashworth Quilt, Generation 4. It was perfect." That night, I sat at the kitchen table with the quilt top folded in front of me. I turned on the lamp and started the hand quilting. Small, even stitches that would hold Teddy's creation together for years to come. It occurred to me that this was the true heart of legacy. Not just what we leave behind, but what we pass forward. And suddenly, I no longer feared the confrontation ahead. Let Dashiell come. Let him see what I'd built without him. Let him witness the full weight of the story he tried to edit me out of. Because I was no longer trying to prove I mattered. I knew I did. And soon so would everyone else. The morning of the exhibition's opening arrived in stillness. The kind of hushed, crystalline silence Vermont knows how to conjure in early spring, when even the birds pause before they sing. My hands trembled only slightly as I smoothed the linen blouse I'd chosen. A rich, earthy plum shade that made my silver hair look intentional, regal even. I clasped a brooch at the collar, a piece I'd found in my mother's jewelry box years ago, and saved for something I couldn't quite name until now. I stood in front of the full-length mirror in my bedroom, the one Harold had hung just after we moved in, the wood frame still carved with faint initials from a previous century, and took in the reflection. I looked whole. Not polished, not perfect, but whole. My eyes, so long accustomed to the soft gaze of support roles, had a different fire now, a quiet certainty. The woman looking back at me wasn't someone's wife or mother or aging placeholder. She was an artist, a keeper of legacy, a steward of memory, a force. Rosalind arrived early, helping me pack the car with the final materials. Flowers from our garden for the welcome table, thank you notes for the volunteers, the community tribute, Wall's last additions. She hugged me in the driveway with a long exhale. "You look like you belong in a portrait," she said. "I feel like I finally stepped into one." Bea met us at the museum entrance with a clipboard and a gleam of excitement in her eyes. "It's beautiful, Cordelia," she said, squeezing my hand. "Everything is just right." I nodded, too choked up to speak. The gallery smelled faintly of wood polish and history. Spotlights had been carefully angled to highlight the textures and hues of the quilts, some stretched on angled panels, others hanging like banners. The letters, sketches, and original sewing tools from the Millbrook Collective were displayed in elegant glass cases, each accompanied by thoughtful placards Bea and I had written together. The centerpiece, Eleanor's restored wedding ring quilt, floated like stained glass in a cathedral. Visitors trickled in early, drifting reverently through the space. Then came the press. First local news, then Vermont Living, and finally an independent documentary crew from Massachusetts who were working on a series called Reclaiming American, Women's Art. They asked if they could film my opening remarks. I hesitated for a breath, then nodded. Yes, but only if you get a close-up of the stitches. At 5:30 p.m., the guests began arriving in waves. Museum donors, art enthusiasts, local quilters, former students of Harold who wanted to support his widow. Jasper arrived with a bouquet of tulips and a soft smile. "You're radiant," he said. "I'm ready," I replied, but I wasn't ready for who walked in at 6:05 p.m. Dashiell, he came alone. No Felicity, no children, no entourage. He wore a charcoal gray suit with a blue silk tie I'd given him 15 years ago. His eyes scanned the gallery like a man trying to read a foreign language, and finding to his surprise that he recognized the script after all. He didn't come toward me right away. Instead, he moved slowly from piece to piece, pausing in front of the quilts, then the letters, then the community wall. He read every plaque, studied every texture, as if trying to trace meaning backwards. I kept one eye on him as I moved through the crowd, greeting old friends, accepting congratulations, with Grace giving quick interviews. But a part of me, the woman who had raised him, who had sacrificed for him, who had loved him even after his coldest rejection, was bracing for something, a storm, a reckoning, or nothing at all. Finally, just before the gallery lights dimmed for the opening remarks, he approached. Mom. I turned. He looked thinner somehow, more human than I remembered. Dashiell, he hesitated, his hands in his pockets. I wasn't expecting this. Most people weren't, I said. He looked around again. It's overwhelming. Yes, a long pause settled between us. I didn't rush to fill it. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded paper. I found this while going through some old files at home. It's a letter you wrote me in college. I never opened it until yesterday. My heart stuttered. I remembered that letter. I'd written it in 1997, after his first tech startup failed, when he was considering dropping out of MIT. It was full of encouragement, of belief, of faith in his resilience. I'm sorry I didn't open it sooner, he said, voice lower now. And I'm sorry I didn't see you. Tears sprang to my eyes, sudden and unwelcome. Why now? He looked away. Because I thought you had stopped being someone who could surprise me. I thought I knew everything about you. And tonight proved how wrong I was. He stepped closer. What you've done here, it's extraordinary. You didn't just honor Grandma's legacy. You made it matter again. You made it matter for everyone. I took a breath. And now that I matter again, what will you do with that? He blinked, caught by the quiet challenge in my voice. I don't know, he said. But I'd like to find out, if you'll let me. I studied him. The son who had once dismissed me as irrelevant now stood before me uncertain, not as a conqueror, but as a man humbled by the truths he could no longer deny. I'm not asking you to fix anything, I said. You can't rewrite what's already stitched, but you can choose how you handle the thread in your hand now. He nodded, eyes glinting, Then, almost as an afterthought, he said, "Teddy told me he made a quilt." "He did," I said, warmth returning to my voice. "It's in the student gallery across the hall. He said he wants to learn more, about all of it," I smiled. "Then you better catch up." Later that evening, I stood before a microphone as the gallery lights dimmed, and the spotlight found me. "Good evening," I began. "My name is Cordelia Ashworth, and I am honored to welcome you to Stitched in Silence, the lost collective of Millbrook." A hush fell over the room. For most of my life, I thought quilts were just domestic objects, blankets, comfort. Things passed from hand to hand, often without ceremony. But over the last year, I've come to understand something deeper. Quilts are stories. They're architecture. They're memory, encoded in thread. They are art. I paused, scanning the faces of those gathered. Bee, Jasper, Rosalind, Ezra, who had flown in that morning. Teddy, sitting in the front row, beaming, and Dashiell standing in the back, watching. These pieces you see around you were created by women who were not given gallery walls or museum placards in their lifetimes. But they stitched anyway, quietly, steadily, because they knew that their work mattered, even if the world didn't say so. Yet, I felt a lump rise in my throat, but pressed on. And for too long, I too believed the lie that my time had passed, that my contributions were behind me, that I had nothing left to say. But I was wrong, and tonight I am proud to stand not in defiance of that erasure, but as proof that the story is still being written. Applause broke like a wave, and in it, I saw the arc of my life, the years of silence, the sacrifices, the hidden brilliance, waiting for its moment in the light. After the talk, Jasper kissed my cheek and said, "I've never seen someone command a room with thread and truth like that." Bee hugged me tight and whispered, "Your grandmother would be weeping with pride." And Dashiell, he waited until the crowd thinned, then approached with a simple request. "May I see the unfinished quilt?" I led him to the private display in the back room, where Eleanor's final uncompleted piece lay in a climate-controlled case, next to the one I had finished with her fabric, her notes, my hands. He stared for a long time. "You added your own section," he said, noticing the tonal shift where her original piecing ended and mine began. "Yes," he nodded slowly. "It's beautiful." Then he looked at me. "So are you." I didn't reply. I didn't need to. The work said everything. That night I returned home to find a note tucked into my front door. It was from Margaret Ellis Cordelia. "You've done what few women ever get to do. You've told the truth out loud and made the world listen. I have a business proposal I'd like to discuss. Let's talk over coffee next week. Congratulations again." Margaret, I turned the note over and found a postscript. "P.S. A local filmmaker asked if he could option your story for a documentary. I told him to get in line." I laughed, deep, delighted, free. And then I did what I always did when something extraordinary happened. I threaded my needle and began the next stitch. The exhibition ran for 3 weeks, and every day I returned to the museum like it was a chapel. Not out of obligation, but reverence. Something sacred had taken root there, in the gallery lights, in the reverent hush of visitors, in the quiet stir of thread and story reclaiming their place in the world. By the second week, people were making pilgrimages. A woman flew in from Chicago after seeing the article in the New York Times. Another came up from Atlanta with her mother's quilt folded carefully in her arms, seeking advice on how to preserve it. Quilting circles began planning group trips to Millbrook. The local bookstore couldn't keep copies of American women's textile art, 1900, 1950 in stock. On the Thursday before closing weekend, a teacher from a nearby high school brought an entire class of seniors for a guided tour. They shuffled in with bored expressions and smartphones clutched like armor. But by the end, they weren't just looking. They were listening, touching the hand-sewn blocks, through gloves, of course, whispering about the colors, snapping pictures, not for social media but to remember. And one of them, a girl in a faded hoodie and chipped blue nail polish, came up to me at the end. "I didn't think I'd care about quilts," she said. "But this feels like time travel, like secrets, like proof." "Proof of what?" I asked. She looked at me, eyes wide. "That women have always been making things that matter." I had to sit down after that. It wasn't just about recognition anymore. It was about restoration, not of cloth, but of value, of place, of worth. And that was when the real test came, because the universe, in its wisdom, always asks one last question before letting you keep the ground you've gained. What will you do when power finally returns to your hands? It started with an email from my bank. "Dear Ms. Ashworth, a recent inquiry was made requesting access to account information and authority on a dormant joint account under the names Harold Ashworth and Cordelia Ashworth. As your spouse is deceased, any changes to account status require your authorization. The inquirer was listed as Dashiell Ashworth. Please contact us to confirm whether you approve this request." I stared at the screen for a long time, the quiet of my sewing room closing in like a tide. Dashiell. Again. Trying to claim something quietly through back channels. I clicked reply and typed one word. Denied. Then I called him. He picked up on the second ring. "Hey, Mom. Everything okay? I received notice that you tried to access my account." A pause. I didn't realize it was still active. I was looking into estate documents and old investments Dad might have left unclaimed. I thought I could help." "You thought you could help by going behind my back?" "Mom, He stopped, exhaled. "I didn't mean anything shady. I just thought maybe I could simplify things for you." "Dashiell," I said quietly, "you still don't see me. You see a problem to manage, an asset to optimize. That's not fair." "No," I said, "it's not. But it's true." There was a long silence. Then, "I'm sorry." I waited. "I'm trying," he added. "I really am. It's just hard to let go of being the one who knows best." "That must be exhausting," I said, and hung up before I softened. The next day, I sat down at the kitchen table with a pen and a legal pad. Not to write a will, but a legacy letter. I started with Eleanor, then my mother, then myself, then Rosalind, and Ezra, and finally, Teddy. I wrote about the women who came before, and the stories we forgot to tell. I wrote about art made in silence and rediscovered with fire. I wrote about regret and forgiveness and what it means to stitch a life back together when the world tells you it's too late. I wrote, "You are never too old to begin." And that became the title of the essay I submitted to Vermont Journal of Arts and Culture when the editor called and asked for something personal and powerful. 2 days before the exhibit closed, Jasper and I took a walk along the riverbank behind the museum. The air was soft with coming summer, the breeze laced with honeysuckle and the rustle of young leaves. "I've been thinking," Jasper said, slipping his hand into mine, "about the next chapter." "Oh," I said, amused. "Whose?" "Ours." I stopped walking. He smiled. sheepish and hopeful. "Would you consider going with me to the Berkshires next month? There's a quilt show and a cabin, and I'd like to wake up next to someone who stitches sunlight into her days." I laughed, stunned and delighted. "I think I would." He leaned in. "You are an extraordinary woman, Cordelia Ashworth, and it's time someone took care of you. Not because you need it, but because you deserve it." This time, I let myself believe it. The final night of the exhibit, we held a closing reception. The gallery hummed with soft music, clinking glasses, and the kind of laughter that only comes after something beautiful has lived fully and well. I gave no speech this time. I simply stood near Eleanor's quilt, shaking hands, listening to stories, accepting thanks with a grace I hadn't known I possessed. Then, quietly, Florence Bancroft approached. She wore no jewelry, no pretense, just a somber black dress and an expression of uneasy respect. "Cordelia," she said. "I owe you more than an apology." I arched an eyebrow. "That would be a good start." "I underestimated you, and I underestimated what this work meant. To you. To all of us." I said nothing. She glanced at the community tribute wall. "You changed the conversation." "No," I said. "The conversation was always happening. I just turned up the volume." She gave a short laugh. "Touché. Well, if you ever consider publishing a book, my firm would be honored to handle the representation." "I'll consider it," I said coolly, "but only if the contract starts with the words, 'full creative control.'" She nodded. "Fair." When I finally returned home that night, tired but glowing, I found one more letter waiting in the mailbox. It was from Teddy, a single sheet of notebook paper folded twice. "Grandma, I'm going to learn how to make real quilts now. Not just art ones. I want to make one for you, and one for Dad, and maybe even one for someone I haven't met yet. You said quilts tell stories. I think you're one of the best stories I've ever read. Love, Teddy." I pressed the note to my chest and wept, not from sadness, but from the sublime ache of fulfillment, the kind that only comes when the final knot has been tied and the thread snipped clean. The next morning I sat at my sewing table, pulled out a blank piece of graph paper, and began sketching. A new design? It would be bold. It would be strange. It would mix Eleanor's tradition with my own instincts, my own rhythm, my own wild color combinations. It would be entirely mine. And this time I would sign it. Clearly, proudly, permanently, because this story, finally, belonged to me. 3 months after the exhibition closed, the quilts were packed and stored with care, the press clippings filed in acid-free sleeves, and the last of the gallery cards mailed to donors with personalized notes of thanks. The museum director, Charles Ludlow, had called to tell me that Stitched in Silence had broken their seasonal attendance records and had been approved to travel to 3 other regional museums, with a potential 4th in Pennsylvania. But I wasn't thinking about galleries anymore. I was thinking about my garden. The zinnias were in full bloom, standing like rows of little suns in front of the porch. The wild phlox that Harold used to grumble about had crept back with stubborn joy. I let it. I found its tenacity comforting. Rosalind had brought over her daughters the day before to help plant fresh herbs in the raised beds Jasper had built. For me, we'd spent the afternoon with dirt under our nails and lemonade sweating in glasses, and I'd caught the girls whispering about how cool it was that their grandmother was in a museum. Cool. That word made me laugh, but I didn't correct them. Jasper arrived just before noon, holding a folded newspaper under one arm and a picnic basket in the other. He looked more relaxed these days, as though my steadiness had found its way into his bones. "You're on page 3, he said, handing me the paper. I opened it to find my name just below the headline, "Preserving the Thread. How Cordelia Ashworth redefined her legacy and ours." The article was thoughtful, reverent. It framed the exhibition not just as a success, but as a turning point in the public recognition of domestic artistry. The author called it a quiet revolution, stitched by hand. "I suppose I'm revolutionary now," I said. Jasper grinned. "You always were." Now the world's caught up. We ate lunch on the porch. Cold pasta salad, lemon cookies, and slices of sharp cheddar on rosemary crackers. Jasper poured iced tea into mason jars, and for a while we didn't speak. We just were. Companionable, at ease, content in the space, between now and what might come. Eventually he said, "You could still say no, you know." "To what?" "To the foundation." "Ah, yes, the foundation." A week earlier, I'd received a formal proposal from the Vermont Women's Heritage Arts Initiative, an offer to create a named fund in Eleanor Whitlock's honor, dedicated to preserving textile art and funding mentorships for late-blooming artists over the age of 50. They wanted me to lead it. I had hesitated, not because I didn't believe in the cause, but because leadership once again meant responsibility, visibility, decision-making, the energy to fight for budgets, to argue for space in a world that still defaulted to oil paintings and ceramics. "I'm tired," I told Jasper, "but not done." He replied. He was right. I said yes 2 days later. Dashiell stopped by the house for the first time in nearly a year. He pulled into the driveway in a rented Subaru. No BMW, no Felicity. She had left him, he explained, on amicable terms that sounded more like branding than heartbreak. He looked lighter, less trimmed at the edges. I met him on the porch, arms crossed loosely. He had called ahead. There would be no more surprises between us. "Mind if I sit?" he asked. I nodded to the rocker beside mine. For a while, we just listened to the wind move through the maples. "I read your article," he said finally. "The one about generational memory." "I didn't expect you to." "I didn't expect it to punch me in the gut." I looked at him. "I used to think that visibility was the same as validation," he said. "But watching what you did, what you built, it made me realize that real worth doesn't need permission. It just needs to stop apologizing." That was the closest he would ever come to saying, "You were right." And that was enough. "I'm not asking to rewrite the past," he continued. "But I'd like to contribute to the foundation. Quietly, anonymously, if you prefer." I considered him. "Would this be a transaction or a transformation?" He winced, then smiled. "Hopefully the second. But you're the expert on making scraps into beauty." I didn't smile back. Not yet. "Teddy's quilt is almost done." His eyes lit. He told me. Said it's called The Longest Thread. "It's beautiful," I said. "And entirely his." He nodded. "Maybe I could learn." "You'd have to start from the beginning." "I know," he said. "That's what makes it honest." The first grant from the Eleanor Whitlock Foundation was awarded that fall to a woman named Lucia Herrera, a 64-year-old former seamstress from New Mexico who had created an entire series of quilts inspired by desert birds and migration. Her letter moved me to tears. I thought my life's work had ended when my last child left for college. I thought the world had forgotten my hands. Thank you for reminding me that there is still time, Still beauty, still more to say. I printed her letter and pinned it beside my sewing table. It reminded me of what this all meant. It wasn't about fame. It wasn't even about justice. It was about recognition, that unspoken, profound human need to be seen in the full complexity of one's life, and once seen, to be understood. On the last Sunday in September, we gathered in the garden for a small celebration. Family, friends, museum staff, the women, from the remnant circle, and the young artists the foundation had funded so far. Teddy unveiled his finished quilt with a dramatic flourish, his cheeks red with pride and a hint of nerves. The crowd gasped. It wasn't perfect. Some seams curved where they should have run straight. One corner bulged slightly. But the colors, deep indigos, warm ochres, tiny bursts of embroidered phrases like "keep going" and "this matters," told the story of his lineage, his learning, his leap into legacy. He looked at me, eyes hopeful. Did I get it right? I knelt beside him, touched the edge of the quilt with reverence. You got it exactly right, I said. You told the truth in your stitches. That night, after everyone had gone home and the garden had grown quiet again, I stood on the porch beneath the stars and felt the weight of the years settle into something softer. Not regret, not grief, not even triumph, but peace. The kind that comes when the arc of your life begins to close with meaning. When the threads you've carried find their place, when the story you feared might end in silence sings instead, with color. They once told me I was too old to matter. They said to step aside gracefully. But I didn't. I stepped forward. Not loudly, not violently, but with thread and memory, with pattern and purpose. And in doing so, I stitched myself back into the story, where I had always belonged. 3 years had passed, and in that time the world had shifted just enough to feel like a new stitch in an old fabric. Millbrook had embraced its quiet fame as a center of textile heritage. The museum's traveling exhibit had been extended twice, and now included new sections. One for regional artists over 60, another for family-based collaborations. Tourists visited year-round, not for ski slopes or antique barns, but to see the quilts. My grandmother's quilts, my quilts, Teddy's. I had grown used to the unexpected emails, students asking for interviews, museums seeking permission to reprint parts of my lecture, women writing from across the country to say, "I started quilting again because of you." I answered as many as I could. Always with warmth, always with humility. But I never got used to the moment when they called me an artist without hesitation. That word had been denied to me for so long, I'd nearly forgotten how it felt to wear it. Not as a wish or a whisper, but as truth. The Eleanor Whitlock Foundation had expanded its reach. We now supported more than 40 artists annually, offered traveling workshops, and hosted an annual gathering in Millbrook each fall, the Threaded Gathering, which had become something like a pilgrimage for women who had been told their time had passed. They came with graying hair and wrinkled hands, with hearts both burdened and bursting. They came to be seen, at last, that October, on the eve of the 3rd Threaded Gathering. I stood on the newly constructed porch of the Eleanor Whitlock textile studio, built with foundation funds and community donations. We'd converted the town's old trolley barn into a fully equipped creative space. Sunlight pouring in through skylights, wooden tables covered with fabric, sewing machines lined like quiet sentinels waiting for their next story. I watched as a group of women arrived with overnight bags and wide-eyed wonder, their steps tentative but full of anticipation. Some brought their daughters, some brought their granddaughters. One woman, no older than 35, pushed her mother's wheelchair with practiced love. "This," I whispered to myself, "is what healing looks like." Rosalind approached, with a clipboard and a knowing smile. Her daughters, now in college, were back home for the weekend and helping with setup. Ezra had flown in again, this time with his new partner, a fellow environmental attorney named Lionel, who had cried openly the first time he saw Eleanor's quilt. And Dashiell, he was coming too. In fact, he was teaching a workshop. The idea had surprised me when he first proposed it. A digital archive tutorial for older artists who wanted to preserve their work online. He had created a user-friendly software just for that purpose, called it Legacy Craft. "It's my way of translating code into care," he'd said. It was a start. And Teddy? He was 17 now, taller than me, shoulders squared with quiet pride. He had applied to an arts program in Boston and submitted 3 quilts with his portfolio. All 3 were accepted. "Your stitches will go farther than mine ever did," I told him once. He just hugged me and said, "Only because I followed yours." That night, after the first round of workshops concluded, we hosted an outdoor screening of the documentary that had premiered earlier that year at a regional films festival, The Quilt That Changed Everything, the story of Cordelia Ashworth. I had resisted the title at first. It sounded too grand, too clean. But the director, a woman named Jamie who had grown up in foster care with a quilt as her only constant, had said something I couldn't argue with. It didn't change everything for the world, but it did for you, and maybe for others too. That's enough. We projected it onto the side of the barn. Guests sat wrapped in handmade blankets, sipping cider under a canopy of string lights and early stars. The film was gentle but unflinching, documenting at not just my rise but the years I'd buried my voice. It showed old footage of the house on Maple Street, shaky camcorder clips of me at my sewing machine, interviews with Bea, Jasper, Ezra, and even Dashiell, who had spoken with vulnerable honesty about the blind spots he'd inherited and the ones he'd created. "I thought progress meant moving fast," he said in the film. "But my mother taught me that it also means circling back and lifting up what was ignored." The crowd was silent when the credits rolled. Then applause. Then tears. Then laughter. Then long hugs in the dark. After the screening, Bea and I sat in rocking chairs just outside the studio, watching the fire pit burn low. She was nearly 82 now, but as sharp and direct as ever. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't picked up that needle?" she asked. "All the time. And I'd still be here, but I'd be smaller." She nodded, then leaned back and closed her eyes. "We don't talk enough about how women shrink. Not just physically, but spiritually. We make ourselves fit other people's needs until we forget our own shape." I looked out at the silhouettes of women helping each other gather quilts from the lawn, laughter drifting like smoke. "I think we're finally remembering," I said. The next morning I rose before sunrise and padded barefoot to my sewing room. My hands moved instinctively, selecting fabric from the shelf, arranging it in subtle gradations of blue and gold. This one wouldn't be for a show. It wouldn't hang in a museum or be archived in any digital vault. This quilt would be for me a personal piece, a thank you, a prayer. As I pinned the first pieces together, I glanced over at the small shelf above my machine. It held 5 things: my grandmother's sewing scissors, a copy of the article from the Times, a photograph of me holding my first finished quilt, Teddy's first practice block, stitched slightly crooked, and a small framed quote I had embroidered. Years ago, long before anyone else had noticed it. We are the thread, the needle, and the hand. We mend what time would unravel. That morning, with soft music playing and the scent of coffee rising from the kitchen, I began again. Because there would always be another story to stitch, another truth to quilt into being. Another woman waiting, somewhere in the silence, for a sign that her voice, too, still mattered. And if I could be that sign, well, that would be the finest piece I ever made. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.